And I'm
Yeah.
not here making karaoke music. I'm making records. And in records, the
Love
story
it.
is always going to win.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Stokes Sounds podcast. I'm your host, Ed Stokes, and joined with me today is incredible mixing engineer, Miles Walker.
Hey,
Miles, how are you doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I absolutely love your work, and that's really why I wanted to get you on, for us audience to kind of hear about you more, behind the scenes of some of the greatest mixes that I absolutely love. So it's incredible kind of to, have you on, and I want you to tell us all
I've
your
got none,
secrets.
like some of your other guests, like who I worked with, and I was his assistant, Leslie Brathwaite. I'm of his school, so there's no secrets here. I'll let the cat out the bag.
Okay.
Whatever you want to know, let me know.
Amazing. Well, Miles, our listeners are going to know, who you are and the music that you've worked on because you've done some great stuff. But if you want to just give yourself a little bit of an introduction, your early days to kind of where you're at now, and just a little bit about you, that would
Yeah,
be
of course.
amazing.
So,
Thank you.
I always played music growing up. I was an upright bass player, which I loved playing in bands and stuff like that. And then, when it was time to get serious and go to school, I went to North Carolina School of the Arts, studying classical music and some jazz. And then it was time to go to college, and I had some opportunities to play in classical programs, but I was like, "Oh, that's a tough life, man. It's a tough life to be a classical player, even though I love it. Not a lot of jobs." I was like, maybe I should look at something else that's more safe for employment, like recording engineering. Joke was on me, thinking that was a good, safe job. But at the same time, I took a tour at Berklee College of Music, and it was really great because they had a music technology program, and as well as like being a performer. So you could kind of do both. And it was great. Also, joke on me, thinking I'd have time to do both. Once I got up there, I realized that it was either one or the other if you wanted to be serious about it. So my bass playing went down significantly, and my time in the studio went up, 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 up. But once I started working on that, I realized that actually making records were as much fun to me as performing on them. So I loved helping people get the sound that was stuck in their head out, and like the challenges as an engineer of like decoding people's version of warm or sounding smooth. I actually really love that. That's like, it's like another language.
Yeah.
So, and everybody speaks it differently. So it was really fun. And I was like really into the craft of engineering. So, after graduating, it was like time to get a job. And, I'm from the South. So back then it was like, if you want to be serious, it's Miami, LA, or New York. Those are the only options that are available. And I was like, well, what about Nashville? I don't really love country music, but it's in the South. I was like, let's try that. And I went to Nashville, and it was great, but it was all country music, especially back then. And I was like, oh, this is tough. And even though I had some good internship opportunities and was like learning a whole lot, and the players and the engineers there are the best, I wasn't really connected to the music I was making. And I had done a Tim McGraw album and a Shadazy album, and I went to the store to go buy them to like get my little assistant credits. But I didn't have any money, and I went and bought like Ludacris's first album and Ti's first album, and I was looking at the credit booklets, and they were all mixed in Atlanta by Leslie Brathwaite in a studio called Patchwork, and I was like, "This is stupid. This is where I should be." So even though I had some assisting
Yeah.
and interning experience, I packed up and I moved to Atlanta and totally hit the reset button on my career. Went back down to being an intern, but I was at Patchwork, and I was around Leslie and around the records I really loved, like hip hop and R&B was just what spoke to me, because I'm also a DJ. So like that kind of stuff was just like really what I wanted to hear and be around it, because you're in the studio all day, every day. You have no life. So you might as well enjoy what you're doing. And it was great. I started to meet
Love
more
that.
people in Atlanta through Leslie, got opportunities to record some people like Usher, and work with a lot of producers like Jazzy Faye, Brian Michael Cox, Jermaine Dupri, all those guys. And then ultimately I met Sean Garrett, and he's a songwriter for tons of people. And I became his recording engineer, and we recorded a lot of people, Britney Spears, Pussycat Dolls, lots of people over time. And then through them, I met Stargate, who Stargate was one of my dream clients because I love the way that they produce records, and also just their sensibilities around like what goes into songwriting, and then even on the personal side, like what goes into having a balanced family life. I really liked those guys a lot and looked up to McKellen Tor in that way. So after that, I became their engineer, and we got to do quite a few good records for Rihanna and Katy Perry, and you know Chris Brown, lots of people, and it was just really good opportunities through them. Coldplay, yes, other stuff. So, and then all that time, I had started mixing my own records for them and for other people, and then eventually transition into full time just mixing records in my own studio here in Atlanta, and that's what I've been doing. So it's pretty good.
Amazing. Do you know what? It's so interesting because you've done such a a vast majority of kind of things, you know, going to Nashville and then going to Atlanta where you kind of wanted to do it. And I actually came across you because one mix, I mean, we can get into it, but it may surprise you because I think it was a mix you did 9 years ago, and it was Time
Oh
Flies
man,
Once in a
awesome! Yeah.
While. That do you know what, that came up on my Spotify. I probably added that song. I mean, I
Thank you,
listen to
man.
all kinds of music, right? But that song, there was just something about it. There was, the vocals were just sitting right, the way that the synth was kind of placed. And then it was you're on the discography for it, and you're credited. I was
Yeah.
like, I need to, you know, it's probably not a huge track, you know, considering you've done Katy Perry, Rihanna, compared to, you know,
Well,
but I mean,
well,
that was a
it's
good
one of my
mix.
favorites though because I love Cal and Rez. Like those are my boys, and like they've been really good to me
Right,
my whole career. I mixed most all of Time Flies releases forever. You know, from when they,
right, yeah,
early days to when they kind of finished up making music. A while, and I still holler at Rez all the time, and I have so much respect for Cal, who just wrote the number one record in the country over here for so he's still writing, doing great work and
wow,
stuff like that. But that one was really
yeah,
special
yeah,
in particular for them because that was their first independent release after they had been on a label. So they were like, hey man,
wow,
thanks for sticking with us. We don't have that major label budget. And I was like, oh, you guys are just cool, man. Like it's all good. And that ended up being their most successful record. Like, so it was really kind of incredible to like let
that's
them
so
get
funny.
success
Yeah,
from
yeah,
that. And and they earned it because they worked so hard. And Rob Resnick produces all the music, and Cal does all the top line, and that's Cal singing and everything like that. Cal Shapiro, and those guys are just great to work with. Like they have strong
yeah,
visions of what they want their records to sound like because they've been making music for so long. But they also respect me as a mixer, and if I'm like pushing something a little further or like trying to pull something back that they had forward, like they give it an honest chance. And I have a lot of clients that don't like
yeah,
that. They like me to work, but like within the box of what they're
yeah,
doing, and they're not really open to interpretation.
yeah,
So for them to be in a new place
yeah,
as a independent act and still trust me for all of our years together to like have their best interests, that was the real special one for me. And I think it's since gone platinum, which is great for a fully independent project. And yeah, I have those two plaques, and those guys sent me those plaques, which is another thing that artists don't do anymore. You can
yeah,
buy your plaques, but they sent that to me as a gift, and it was like
yeah. Of
really
course.
cool of them to like honor that. And yeah, love those guys.
Yeah,
Love that
yeah.
record too. It's a really great record. It's fun. That
Well, I mean, you know, I'm a mixer myself, so I'm listening to other mixers and, you know, just hearing kind of what people are doing. I just remember listening to that. It just came on just randomly. And, you know, later on in the podcast, we can kind of get more technical, but I just remember hearing, like, especially the
yeah,
vocal
yeah.
effects in that song. I don't know who did them, but there was a lot of very subtle kind of delays. And yeah, I want you to tell me how you did them because it really resonated with me, that mix. I was like, yeah, that's very, very thought through, not just, you know, a basic kind of mix. So that
Top
was a
liners
good
that
one.
put
But
space at the end of phrases
yeah,
are almost begging for good delays from a mixer down the road. And Cal thinks through records, so like he had stuff in mind, so it was great. But like maybe he did a straight quarter, but I was like, let's filter it
yeah,
out and its side chains to something. Da, da, da. So like I was able to take his starting points and just like maybe push him to the next level. But that's good songwriting too. Sometimes
I mean,
the fun ear candy that works in
yeah,
mixes really only works if the songwriter has left the space for it, or the producer, either way. Because I mean, a lot of times everybody's trying to do something all the time, and it's like there's no room for any stuff like that. You just got to just let it be.
yeah.
But that one had some breathing, which was cool because I mean, like the early
Uh,
2010s, like Tropical House was having a moment. I'd done all the Kygo stuff too, so like
yeah.
I knew how to give that synth the lead, but then obviously it's always around the vocal. Like you always got to let the vocal be the star, even in a moment where the synth is going to carry it later. So little things like that is what you think about.
I love that thought process, what you just said there. I mean, look, while we're on that, then we can go into that part because one thing I've noticed with a lot of your mixes, and even you mentioned Kygo there, is, I mean, for example, Jason Joshua, he does a thing with the TrueVerb plugin
Yeah,
where he does
yeah,
early
sure.
reflections and all of that sort of stuff. And I've noticed with you, I don't know what you're doing, but the way that the synths are placed, well, a lot of people, they'll mix the synth, they'll get that synth bang in, and then they'll try and complement the vocal. But with you, it's like your vocals kind of seem on top, but also within it. But the synths seem to kind of go around the body of the vocal, but the drums seem to hit hard. Like, I know that sounds like a really long way of saying it, but like, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
So as much as you'd want to hear it's this with this effect, side chain to this, da, 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 it's entirely the
Yeah,
sequence. And I come from the Leslie Brathwaite school, and I still mix all my records this way, which
yeah,
is a cappella first. No anything else other than vocals, just going. Because a lot of people are like, let's get this track slamming, slamming, and then let's fit the vocal
yeah,
in. There's a style of music that does that. It's called karaoke. And I'm
yeah.
not here making karaoke music. I'm making records. And in records, the
Love
story
it.
is always going to win. So if it has a vocal, if it has a lyric, that's the focus. So why would I get everything going and then just put the vocal wherever I can get in it and move stuff out the way? I go the other way. I'm like, if this vocal could sound as perfect as I could make it, how would I do that? Well, you just work on the vocal. Put in all your EQ, like that's the way I wish that vocal sounded. All your delays, all your reverbs, be like, that's the way I want it to sound in
In
solo, just
solo,
acapella. Yeah,
you do all that in
acapella, the
solo.
whole record, you know? And I mean, be mindful of the production. Like, you got to keep it in your
Yeah,
mind, but like, do it that way.
yeah, yeah,
And then I bring in the drums because if there are going to be elements of sidechain and stuff like that, you have to have the rhythm in, right? And then there's usually not a lot of competition between the drums and the vocal, like, especially when you don't have any music. And then you bring in the bass, and then it's going to be a balancing. Now, at any given point, something can get muddy. Is it going to be the vocal going to get muddy, or is it going to be the synth you just brought in getting muddy? Now, remember that vocal sounded exactly like you wanted it to sound. So why would I start changing the vocal at that point? If you can, make all your corrections as you bring in the instruments so that they don't compete with this vocal. On really dense productions, it does get to a point where you might have to do a little vocal tweak because you've got 48 strings that you didn't have before when you were EQing thing. But in general, one
yeah,
by one, if you bring in instruments that are important. So after drums and bass and vocal, the main synth, whatever that is, or if it's main guitar in a song, like one by one, and always change at this element you just brought in. If there's competition between that and the vocal, change it at that element, not at the vocal. And then after you brought in a lot of stuff, if you're like, all right, everything's good, but the vocal now is just a little too quiet, of course, because you just brought in a ton of stuff. Maybe you can adjust the overall level or do some like subtle side chain moves if there's like frequency dependent, like mid range stuff that's competing. But in general, you kind of want to leave that vocal to when it was the dream state. And to be fair, that's a common thing I get from people that love my mixes. They're like, well, your vocal always has so much space. I'm just like, just because I think about the vocal first. That's it. Like, it's not like I'm doing something crazy. I
true
use
though.
probably a lot of the same plugins everybody else does, but it's the approach. It's how it
Yeah,
comes together differently. And then at the very end, start thinking about your elements of your master bus and maybe your vocal bus and your drum bus and how those all interconnect. But really, if you build it up in that
yeah,
sequence, you'd be surprised to find a lot of that like masking and space just kind of takes care of itself. It's not easy to mix this way. You have to do it for a while before it becomes second nature. Like the
yeah.
first one, you're going to be like, this does not make sense at all. The second one, you'd be like, it still doesn't make sense. But after a while, you kind of know where it's going to fill up
Get used
and
to it.
like it does make sense. And for me, it makes it the easiest way to work. But everybody's got a different approach. It's all good. There's no right or wrong way to make records. This is just something that I kind of do and saw Leslie doing a lot back in the day with he was doing it with rap stuff, you know what I mean? So I was like, well, let me do
Yeah,
that on more like pop and dance, which is what I typically do. I was like, does this still work? Does this approach still work? Yes, it totally still works because a lot of times the productions in pop and
yeah,
dance have been thought of as musical productions. So those are hitting hard and sound pretty
yeah,
good. And then they just cram a top line on it and it works, but it's not balanced. And I just kind of revert it. So I'm like, let's give the top line space and then reintroduce all those
yeah.
elements. And then it sounds like a record. And that's like, it kind of is just sometimes the approach more than the magic within.
Well, you've
Yeah,
proven
well,
the
I mean,
approach
it works
works.
for me. Yeah, and it works for a lot of people. But I'm always happy that people like the outcome
Yeah,
because it's letting them hear their same record, but
yeah,
just in a different way. Because now, especially, so many people create these records on islands, all production somewhere, all top lining somewhere else. And nobody ever was like, these have to live together as one song. Like nobody has thought of that. So they
Yeah.
just take a 2-track and slap another 2-track on it. And they're like, here's what we're putting out. And it's like, at some point, this is all going to mix together like a stew. And we got to like make
Yeah.
everybody play nice. So it's fine for songwriting, but
Yeah.
it's not great for like delivering a final record.
Yeah, yeah, and within regards to, you mentioned mix bus. I know
Yeah,
Leslie
we are
basically doesn't
very
have
different in that
anything.
respect. Leslie does nothing on the bus. I got sauce
I was
for
going to get onto
days.
that.
So yeah,
I did do some research. You seem to have a lot of analog
definitely.
gear and stuff. And what do you know? Well, okay. Again, while we're on that, then, what are you doing on your mix
I mean,
bus?
I
Are
got some
you? I
favorites
mean,
that are going to
that's
make
probably
it
a long
onto
road to go
most
down.
every record. But, sometimes I also like to think about
Okay.
the style of record and like different color opportunities and like how much heavy lifting did I need to do in the mix? And it's usually a 1-to-1. If I have to do a lot of heavy lifting on the multi-track level, maybe the stuff was in bad shape, maybe it just wasn't really balanced, I tend to do a lot less on the mix bus because if I've had to make massive changes within, I need it to respond that way so that if there's client requests, turn this up, turn this down, I can do those things and they hear the change. The more you put on your mix bus, the less you can do on the multi-track level and not it all be very subtle. And so if it's a client that like needed some heavy lifting, I'm like, I got to keep that open so that the way they hear it the new way, if they're like, no, I need the kick drum like 5 dB louder, I can turn it up 5 dB and it actually is 5 dB. Where if I have aggressive compression on the bus level, I turn it up 5 dB, but really all that means is I'm slamming my compressor 5 dB harder and they're not perceiving it 5 dB louder. And all the compression that I added is now changing the vocals, ducking, and you get yourself in trouble. Whereas if the shape of the record is good, you can add more on the bus level because you're probably only making like subtle moves and you're like, that's fine. That's the color that I want it to be. So you just kind of have to think about your approach of like how much you're going to want to have control down the road versus how much you can do it on like the full stereo bus level. I mean, sub bus stuff is a good way around that. If you feel like you need aggressive stuff, I
Yeah.
always have my mixes set up for like vocal sub bus, music sub bus, drum sub bus, and then the whole sub bus. So I can do things aggressively on those individual buses, and the pieces kind of add up together to make it more manageable.
So when you get a mix, then, and you're starting it. You obviously, I know you mentioned that you start with the
Right,
vocals
right,
first, so you do the leads, the backing vocals, a cappella. When are you then deciding, what's going on
definitely.
that mix bus? Are you doing that while
Uh,
the mix bus is
Not at
on
first.
with the
So
stuff
at
on, or are you
first, when
doing
it's
that
built up a
after?
cappella, there's nothing on any of the
Okay,
buses, any of them. Drums,
right,
nothing on any of the drum bus, drums. Bass, nothing on that. Most important instrument, add that in, nothing on that. At that point on, that's when I'll turn on the mix bus and I'll mix into it. But the core of the record, vocals, drums, bass, most important sound, that's handled on a multi-track level. So like it needs to sound good just on
right.
that level. If it only sounds good, if you've got a million things on it, it doesn't sound that good. So like the trick is to make all the
True.
key elements, which to me, those are the four things
Yeah,
that are the most important in any record is, the drums, bass, main
yeah.
musical element, and the vocals. It's like, if that sounds good with nothing, you're going to be okay. You're going to land that plane on some level. So that is when I start
Yeah.
engaging like the secret sauce that like kind of lifts everything up and changes the dynamic shape and has a little brighter, happy EQ, all the things that like you want on a final record. But if you have them from the beginning, you can trick yourself and think your individual components are a little
Mm.
spicier than they actually are. And sometimes that can get you in trouble. Sometimes that is okay. So like I said, it really just depends on your approach. But usually I'll just leave it off until those four core elements are in shape and
Yeah.
then build from there.
I'm glad you said that, because thinking about it, like a lot of people, they kind of get out their stems, don't they? Put it in, try and make it sound radio ready without touching anything, and you're kind of going into a bit of a
Especially if you
trap, I
do
think. But
multiband stuff. Like, a lot of people like to use multiband
yeah,
compressors because it makes everything loud. That's the most dangerous
yeah,
component to put on your master bus if you
sure,
haven't thought about the general levels. Because, of course, as soon as you put it on, even any kind of preset, mastering preset, everything sounds louder and they're like, we're in there. But you don't really pay attention to the fact that, like, the
Yeah.
bass is just moving at an unrealistic pump that you had never intended for that to be, but it's just because you didn't like
Yeah.
level into it. Whereas like if you level everything ahead of
Yeah.
time and then you turn it on, you can look and see how it's performing and you're like, yeah, that's good. Or you see that crazy bass and you're like, whoa, let me adjust my thresholds because I know that this sounded good without that. So you kind of like don't rely on presets, which are wildly dangerous
Yeah.
for thresholds. They're very good if you
Yeah.
hit it at the threshold that whoever created that preset intended. But you have no idea what threshold they were putting into that when they came up with that because you don't know what their program material was
That's the
like.
thing.
You don't know, whatever. I mean, they probably worked with the developer to come up with like a good general average level, but nobody mixes average.
Yeah.
Everybody mixes at different levels and stuff like that. So,
Of
yeah,
course, there's no set way. Are you a mixer that finally, in the final mix, are you a guy that puts multi-band on your mix bus or not? Because I know there's some people are like no, and other
not
people are
on the
like
level
yeah.
that will ever go to mastering. I really like if I have to do any
Right.
multi-band stuff, if I feel like the mix needs that, it's going to be on the print that's basically a
Yeah.
reference print, which is the version that the client could hear
Right.
and actually approve. But it's like it's done in a way that I'm like, I'd prefer a mastering engineer to handle this, like, and make those final calls because it can shift so much. So
Yeah.
what I'll do is I'll typically have the mix living up to a point that's getting printed and then maybe hit like the multi bus and then like this super brick wall loud button after that. And I'll print the mix both ways and give them both to mastering. So they have it with nothing.
Right.
I tell them
Okay.
I'm like, I hit the loud button, and then they also have it with loud. So if for some reason they have a hard time like recreating it, they have the option to use that file. That's totally available and up to them. But any decent
Yeah.
mastering engineer is like, oh, I hear what he was going for. Let me clean that up a bunch.
So you just take the multi-band, the limiting off, but you leave the other bits that
Exactly.
you had on
If I made
originally,
like
but you
a
just take off
stereo
the loud
EQ that I was
parts
like,
of it.
this sounds good, I'm not going to take that off. I'm going to tell the mastering
Yeah.
engineer that, like, we felt
Yeah.
this was
Yeah.
good. But, because a full stereo EQ or like a
Yeah.
wideband compressor, that's part of the way the mix is
Yeah.
moving. And I want to make sure that's integrated all the way into the final product, no adjustments. But multiband, that's where it gets like, that's subjective. That's like, how's it performing in this
Mm.
environment, in my room versus their car? And like,
Yeah.
that's the kind of stuff where I'm like, let's let mastering with their experience only working on stereo prints, like let's kind of leave that. And really, it's just moves for loudness at that point. It's not that I'm correcting my low end.
Yeah.
If there's something wrong with my low end, I'm getting it back at the multi-track level. I'm not like, I hope this multi-band fixes my bass. It's like, no, fix your mix if that's what your goal is. You just want it to be loud. And there's better
Yeah.
ways around that, I think.
Amazing. So going off kind of, obviously we've spoken about the mix bus and you're mixing. I noticed you got a lot of outboard gear. Are you hybrid? Are you digital? Because like Leslie's just
He's
digital
digital
on a
now.
laptop,
When I
literally.
used to start with Leslie, I was recalling all the channels of the SSL
Ah,
9000J for hours at a time. Thank you so much. But Leslie's approach has always been quite simple. He makes a lot of his corrections on like volume level stuff and like subtle EQ moves versus like ratcheting
yeah.
it down with a ton of bus compressors and like bus EQs. Whereas I'm like, yeah, I'll put all that in there, whatever. So my approach here always has been hybrid for like almost ever because I loved the sonics of hardware gear and also the summing. It was really for me, it was almost more a product of the summing and the headroom. Like you don't get pinched
Okay.
in the digital world. I mean, that's come a long way since 32-bit float, but I'm talking about when I started, it was just like so much easier to just keep making it louder on the desk and like there's no crunch. And I'm like, this is wonderful. So I always did the hybrid, but I would do summing mixers for recall, just so that there was
Yeah.
not hours of fader moves and da da da. It's like use the best of recalling
Yeah.
everything at line level and keep it that way. But I had multiple, like I mentioned, I had a summing mixer for just drums, one for just music, and one for just vocals. And those three summing mixers, all SPL mix streams, were all chained together as like one giant stereo bus that I could then insert stuff across on that.
Okay. Yeah. Are you still on the
No.
mix stream
But
now
the
or?
reason is not for any
Okay.
sonic reason whatsoever. It's because of the need for Atmos. What I've started doing is a lot of almost every one of my major label mixes also requires an Atmos delivery, which like I've really enjoyed mixing in Atmos, but with the budgets the way they are, they're not putting a lot of consideration in Atmos. So if they're not putting a lot of consideration in Atmos, it needs to
Yeah.
be efficient for me. And I would find my stems
Yeah.
sounded great as long as you put them back in my special sauce and da 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 da. But then if I had to take those stems and put them in the Atmos world, I was like, whoo, we are a ways off from the mix. And that was problematic because you kind of want to start
Yeah.
your Atmos sounding exactly like your stereo mix and then just make
Stereo
immersive
mix. Yeah.
imagery changes. In my opinion, I don't want the mix sonically to feel any different than the stereo mix because, especially on
Yeah.
new material, the people haven't heard it. They don't have a point of reference of what it's supposed to sound like. So whether they're discovering a new record immersive or stereo, they should sonically sound the same. I mean, yeah, different image, different all that. Like I understand that. But sonically, they should sound
Yeah.
the same. So therefore, my stems needed to more closely match my final stereo product. So I had to drastically change my approach of using outboard gear that sounded great for all these
Yeah.
stereo prints, but my stems were like a little thin or the balances had kind of changed. And I was like, ooh, yeah, how can I reincorporate this in the box so that come stem time, I can render all this into the audio files so that at Unity it actually does sound like a stereo mix. And I, after much work, came up with a good approach and one by one would replace my like stereo pieces of gear and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, again, not for any reason other than the
Amazing.
need of Atmos. I always preferred working in the analog headroom space and workflow. It just mixes would come together very quickly because of not getting pinched and stuff like that. But takes me a slightly bit longer in the box, but having the ability to get my stems right for Atmos is worth the trade-off for me at this point in time. If I know Atmos is not a consideration ever, I will still 100% do it full analog.
Is that affecting then the way that you're mixing currently? Obviously, if you're doing not as much analog, I guess you're going more digital. So is your kind of techniques and stuff that you were doing in the analog, have you kind of just redone that with plugin emulations, or have you kind of just changed a lot of the things you're
Twofold.
actually doing?
Yes, is the first step. Is one by one, I painstakingly tried to match my favorite pieces of gear because I wanted to mix the exact same way. I didn't want it to be any different. So I was like,
Yeah.
using the same routing. I was like, I did the. Some of them were easy. I used the Clariphonic hardware EQ. Love the Kush stuff. Oh, they got a plug-in. It's pretty close. You know what I mean? And so I'm like, that's
Yeah.
easy. But then there was some, yeah, it's,
Never the same.
you might have to balance some of the level adjustments and stuff like that, but you can get it close.
Yeah.
But then there were some pieces that were hard,
Yeah.
like really hard. And I was like, all right, maybe it's two or three plugins that actually sound like one piece of hardware. And even still
Right.
with that, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, it's close, but let me be mindful of the way the drums squeeze
Yeah.
now. The hardest pieces for me to find, I'll be frankly honest, were the what's it, Dramastic Audio, his compressor, which is just a
Okay.
VCA style compressor, but like it's just so much more. And it's because the transformers that are in there just, it sounded good when it wasn't even compressing. It would do something with the image and the low end that like
Yeah.
you just ran it through the gear. And like those were the hardest things to match. Matching compression, matching EQ,
Yeah.
plugins are pretty good at that, but it's the analog circuitry that is very hard
The
to
harmonic
emulate. Some
saturation
companies
is,
do it better than
yeah.
other, but companies like that, I mean,
Yeah.
Dramastic never made any plugins, so it was just finding pieces that
Yeah.
would do it. I hats off to Acoustica. Their stuff is modeled really extensively, and I think more companies are going the extra mile now with their models. So sometimes it's like a piece of gear that's been around
Yeah.
for a long time in plugin form, but they've done updated models that are paying more attention to the circuitry, not just the compression or EQ curve,
Yeah.
because like it is all that guts that made it different. So that
Yeah.
new, I don't know if you've heard it, but the Relab's new
Acoustic are good.
176
Yeah.
for the retro, it just came
Okay.
out. I
Oh
think
yeah.
it's only in beta right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it uses tremendous processing,
Yeah.
but it's really like the hardware, which is a unique like optical compressor. So it
It's
is.
getting
I
that
think
balance,
so.
isn't
I
it?
think it
Because
is. That's what I think.
Acoustica are
But
great, but
yeah, right. Well,
DSP,
the computers have, I mean, they've
DSP heavy on
skyrocketed
acoustic.
with the silicon. Like if you are running one of
Yeah.
the new
Yeah.
silicon Macs and like you have been running in
Yeah.
Rosetta, which I did for a long time only because I had like sessions would come to me with old plugins and I had to be, but people have kind of caught
Yeah.
up. So I have two rigs. I have one that, runs in Rosetta if I have to recall and one for like silicon. You can shut it off and on. that's almost like getting a new computer. It's amazing how much more efficient it is if it's truly native. So I've been very happy with that. That's been good.
Yeah. Are you doing your Atmos mixes in
I
Logic then, or how are you
use
doing
Pro
your
Tools just
Atmos?
for the familiarity, but Atmos is, or the thing that's really
Yeah.
nice about Logic is you get to monitor in the final Apple codec, which like wasn't available. So I was actually like
Yeah.
taking the extra step of importing mixes over just to listen to them with the Apple codec. And I was like, oh, it's
Okay.
such a waste of time.
Yeah.
But Audio Movers just released a new plugin that allows you to audition the Apple codec in real time. So you can do it
Okay.
right through the Dolby renderer. So I can work in the renderer and then be like, turn on Apple codec and hear like, and it's all of it. You can do head tracking. You can do,
So you
which I
can skip
hate
that.
that stuff.
Yeah.
That stuff is the worst, but like it's worth paying attention to,
Yeah.
especially the codec, because
Yeah.
even though I do a lot of Atmos, I am not thinking there's people out there with 714 speaker arrays sitting still in one listening position. Check out the mix.
Yeah.
It's AirPods, man. Like
Analyzing
I'm
it.
aware that it's AirPods, so that's where I check.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And even though I do have a speaker array, I spend most of the time doing it in headphones because I know that that's where people are going. So I really
Okay.
want to like I listen to it in the room, but if I hear something in the room that's unusual, but then I put it on the headphones and it's not there, I don't really worry about it. Where I know most
Yeah.
people would go the other way. But I'm like, until more people are listening to speakers, I go where the format is for now.
Well, it's the right way, I guess, to look at it. You're going to the main point,
Why do
really,
people,
kind of.
still love monitoring on oratones and stuff like that? It's the lowest common denominator, but
Yeah.
most available final format for people. You know what I mean? Like, and I think you have to think
Yeah.
about where people
Yeah.
are listening to music, how they're enjoying it. Even historically, it's why like Atlanta and Southern music had so much bass because people would listen to it in the clubs. But then, like, New York hip hop was more thin and punchy because people were listening in headphones walking around the city. Like, that, it almost, Sonics can almost dictate a genre. So, like, for what it's worth now, Atmos is a genre. It's more like an add on. So, I feel like
Yeah.
it's important to pay
Yeah.
attention to that
Yeah.
genre and honor that more than like just the Sonics or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Atmos is
For
like a
now,
genre when
I
I
mean, I
think
think it
about
has
it.
the
It's kind of.
potential to be the
Yeah.
format. I mean, and as just completely nerding out,
Yeah.
it is very fun to work with that much space. And I don't mean gimmicky, I just mean not having one stereo bus. The mix breathes so much more because you're just not pegged down on 70 sounds in two channels. It's 70 sound in
Yeah.
11 channels. This is a lot of math to
Amazing.
like make the room, but it has a long way to go. It's not accessible.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very complicated to the end user. That stuff is not good. If it's not easy for the end user to enjoy and they hear drastic differences in volume between the Atmos and the stereo, like especially for things like hip hop, is like that means you got to hit. Atmos with its negative 18 RMS does not hit no matter what you do. It's just not part of the format. So I think they need to
Yeah.
change some of the delivery specs. That's at least my opinion. And I understand why it all exists. Like Atmos has to be able to be folded down to stereo. I'm like, why? If the stereo mix exists, why do I need to fold down my Atmos as well? Like, let them be two separate things so that they don't have the same limitations.
Yeah.
And I think it could really open up and be like more interesting to the listener, which is always what you want. You just want the listener to have the best experience. I
I
think
guess time
so.
will tell,
Yeah.
won't it? Because it's still fairly new, isn't it? Still, But going on to kind of the mixing side of talking about placement and stuff. And when we first started this podcast, I said to you about your vocals always being incredible and kind of sitting on top of the mix. And then you mentioned about that you kind of go with the a cappella first, or you start with vocals first, and then you then go into the instruments. What are you? You don't have to give
They're
all your
available.
secrets
Don't
away,
worry.
but as far as I know that a lot of listeners, they always want to know about the vocals, and that's fair enough because vocals is obviously the most important thing. I've noticed in all of your mixes, your vocals are placed in a consistent way. They seem to kind of always be at the front, but then, as I mentioned earlier, the synths are kind of around it, but they always seem to have really good placement. Now, obviously, it's your ears and your balance and just you, I guess. Is there anything you're doing specifically in your vocal chain um, that maybe a lot of people are not doing, or are you doing everything very kind of simple? Are you doing a lot? And I know that there's been some questions about people saying that they get the vocals to sit right, they then put their limiter on, and then
Yeah,
suddenly the
sure.
kick's loud or the vocals are way too loud. I guess it's a two-part question. Are you mixing the vocals within to a limiter as well for checking for vocal balance and all of that sort of stuff? That
Yeah,
was a
no, no,
big
no.
whirlwind of
I can
questions, but
definitely break it down outside of just the
yeah,
approach. There are a couple elements, and
yeah,
it's really two to think of is like plug-in and dynamic measure, like leveling, and then also arrangement leveling. I think one thing to think of is if you think about, and this is why it's extra hard to do it a cappella first because nothing else is happening. But if you think about the song, like listen to the song real
yeah,
quick, be like, all right, a few guitars come in the B section, 10 cents come in the hook. It's like, all right, so where can I place all the other vocals? And then look at the vocal arrangement. Is it just one lead vocal? Or are we talking about every word has a four stack harmony and then there's like a 10 note breakout of that? I mixed a lot of J-pop and K-pop stuff. And that's like vocal training right there. Because, I mean, you get 10 different
it's
vocalists
like,
in the band and all of them harmonize
yeah,
everything and they like the old R&B style, so it's four stacks of each, so any given note is roughly 40 tracks of vocals. Then you get to the hook and people are doing harmonies and
yeah,
stuff. I mean, I used to have sessions, this is back in the TDM days, that only had 256 voices, and the session would come and it'd be 500 tracks of vocals, so you had to mix it in pieces to print down stems because you literally couldn't even voice count, have all the tracks active at one time. We're only
yeah.
talking vocals. Not to mention the fact that there was like 150 tracks of music too, like that. So it would be like piece by
Oh,
piece. But ironically, that was really helpful because even though it's not how the song flows, it gets you in a mindset of like, let's look at each section. This only has to work section to section, and it can be completely different. Like the B section, I make sure the width is only like this so that when the hook harmonies come in, boom, and if it's the same number of vocals, just that change in image because you've like only allowed yourself to go to 80 degrees with the pan, and then all of a sudden you're 120 and you're like, oh, that opens up so much even though it's still just four stacks of vocals or whatever it is. Adjust your
mm,
panning, let your panning be like another version of EQ, because obviously when stuff is wide it catches the ear a lot less than when it's together, so then it sounds muddy but it's still the same EQ, but maybe you need to EQ it differently and maybe you need to control the dynamic range. The B section is very tight and compressed, but then once it gets to the hook, the vocals can be a little more moving and like poke out for each bit of
yeah.
the performance. So I say all that to say is the first thing is like consider the vocal arrangement against the song and look where you need it to be tight and look where it can be open. Look where it can be narrow, look where it can be wide. Once you start thinking about things like that first, then it makes the things of like, how am I EQing this? How am I limiting this different? In general, all my background buses, whether it's B section, chants, hook stacks, all that does go to like a single bus limiter thing. So that if it comes on, I can always like, all right, automate that, move that up and down so that no vocal jumps out too much as stacks. Always make sure those leads go to a separate bus that do not trigger that. Because if you think about it, that lead ad lib or that lead vocal really wants to run very high, you can't have the whole background section duck down because it's significantly louder. I always feel like the stacked vocals have one level and then the lead vocal wants to be right on top of that. And occasionally, if they need to do a run, it might need to be a lot on top of that. So if all that's the same bus, it's going to like side chain the backgrounds down. And you're like, that's not what I was trying to do. I just wanted the lead vocal to get slightly ducked there, not the whole background. So having those two separations of like leads and ad libs to one bus and all other BGs to another bus, that gives you that ability to let those vocals jump if the lead vocals and ad libs jump if they need to, and stay like a more uniform level.
Are you processing the individual backgrounds separately as well with EQ, or are you, let's say you've got full part harmony, are they just going to a chorus harmony bus and
Usually
processing only the
individually, but not
bass
aggressively.
verse?
Individually, the things that I find
Right.
beneficial are, of course, if it needs any kind of tuning, you have to do that on the multi-track level. You can't do that on bus level. But also, I find
Yeah.
de-essing because it is valuable to de-ess on the bus, but with timing differences across each vocal in a stack, it's kind of
Mm.
like the de-esser might jump on the first vocal, which was slightly early, and then DS too long because one vocal was late, and now all of a sudden your S is like really ducked. Whereas like if you DS individually,
Yeah.
it's okay. So I typically will do like maybe like real subtle mud correction EQ on the individual ones if they were recorded poorly. If not, I'll just leave it to the bus level. But I will do DSing on the individual level because I feel like that once you add it all together on the bus level, a DSer there is working too hard if it's trying to
Yeah.
catch all of that sibilance. So, and I love that Massey DSer. That's the
Are
one,
you
boy.
doing?
That's always been the one for me. Love
Yeah.
Massey. So good.
Really?
I
I'm
like
on
that
the
one
Pro
too.
DS, the Fab
Ironically,
Filter
I
one. I
like that
always.
one on the bus
Yeah.
level. There's a setting within that you can
Okay.
do. It says like all around
Yeah.
or whatever. So I prefer the
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
around on the bus level because it's kind of like capturing the sum
Yeah.
total of S's. But if you do it on the individual, it's like, I think it's called like single or something like that. It sounds better on the single. But the
Yeah.
Massey one, here's what I like about that. You set it very simple, frequency, da, 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 da. Then it has a wet dry, which is kind of like a nice way to dial it in. So you can like over DS very quickly. So
Okay.
you hear it working and then just back it off. And you're like, yep,
Yeah.
that's it. That's very easy. I like that. Yeah, and it's
Parallel
very
DSing.
DSP light. Like the Pro DS is great.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, in my opinion, Fab Filter is the best made stuff when you want no sonic imprint. Like when you want to like cleanly correct anything, EQ, compression, limiting. I was like, it's very sonically
Yeah. Yeah.
neutral, and I like that for subtle stuff. Like they're the best in my opinion by far. It
Pro
really
Q
is.
is
And
like
I
the
mean, they
number
keep
one
making
EQ
it better
amongst
with the
engineers,
dynamic
isn't it?
components and stuff like that, and even the
Yeah.
match portion of it. A lot of people don't use that, but sometimes I get a vocal that's recorded 2 different days, two
Yeah.
different places, and it's like two different mics, and you're like, ooh, I'm gonna have to
Slightly.
really go surgery mode. But if you like the first take but not the second, and you feed the first take to the second, you can
Yeah.
get a corrective EQ on it that's like, oh, that saved me a lot of time. So that very cool features in that company. I like that stuff a lot.
Are you doing a lot of in the vocal kind of mixing? Are you doing lots of riding, or are you doing quite static automation moves? Because I notice a lot of younger engineers these days they kind of don't really have
Sure.
faders; they just click and mouse. What are you
I'm
doing in
not a
the tracks you're
hands-on fader
mixing?
guy myself either. I like to handle as much of that through
Okay.
good dynamic control. Obviously, if it's a wild performance and a wild recording, you're going to get to the point where you can't. The thing to always remember is the plugins, as you put them on, at least in Pro Tools, that's source level. So, if the
Yeah.
vocal is overly dynamic, your thresholds are really only hitting when it is loud. It's not like a consistent. And sometimes,
Yeah.
if it's a background, you might want like a more consistent level of compression because of the sonics that imparts. So, this was old school Leslie Trick too, back in the day when there didn't used to be as much processing. Is like he'd come up with the general setting just like I would on de-essing or compression or whatever, and then look at the vocal recording. And if there was a big chunk that was like low, they were off the mic or whatever, he would just gain that up. Now, that used to be an audio suite trim
Click
gain.
on it.
Now
Yeah.
you can obviously chop the section and do clip gain. But I think it's important to do a
Yeah. Yeah.
combination of both
Yeah.
ultimately when you're delivering the performance, because if you just do it on the fader level, you might control the
Yeah.
dynamics, but then your sonic is changing based on if the recording was quiet or loud. You kind of want to in between of both. So, like, instead of clip gaining something down 6 dB, how about you clip gain it down 3 and then turn up the volume 3? And you get like a balance of like a more natural, well
Yeah.
recorded performance, even if it wasn't well recorded or not a good performance. You kind of like split the difference between
Yeah.
the two.
Do you know, I'm interested with your kind of mixing style in the sense of like, for example, like Leslie, when I chat to him, he's not using much kind of vocal effects. I know at the start of this episode, I mentioned about I love the vocal effects, you were using. Are you a lot of the mixes you're doing? Are the producers sending you the vocal effects, or are you adding your own doublers, slap delays? Because some people use a lot of that, and some people just use
Totally,
a reverb and
totally. I
that's
I
it.
think it is really
So
production
yeah,
producer dependent. Some guys really are not considering that. They're just considering the songwriting and maybe the track stuff. And this like vocal reverb, and they're like, we
yeah.
use this on every single song, no matter what. And sometimes that's really magical for that song. And other times I'm like,
Oh, hello.
you want some reverb. I
Yeah,
get it.
yeah,
So like it's really based on the relationship. But some guys have really thought that
yeah,
stuff out. And I would definitely honor their choices. It make its way into my version even if it wasn't my settings, because when people get used to hearing a song with those specific ping pong quarter note delays, and you're like, I'm gonna just take that out because I didn't use it. It's like, that's a dangerous move. You would definitely want to have the
Yeah.
conversation if you felt like it needed. If it's like, hey, you kind of got too much stuff going on, maybe you want to think about backing it off. The most I'll typically do is if they were really processing heavy, instead of removing anything, I
Mm.
might experiment with the amount of return. Like most often, even guys that do a lot, they come up with a lot and they just leave it on. And that's what a lot of people do. That's great
Yeah.
for songwriting. But there's an opportunity, even if you want those on all the time, to use 10% less in the verse so that it's a little bit drier and it just kind of pulls you in. But then the BGs come in and then like wetting it up 5% more so that it's like, oh, it's a different space because we've entered the next section of the song. And again, you can still use all
Yeah.
their settings, like you don't have to change it, but it's just the relationship of how much it was to being a static, or side chaining the lead to some of the
Yeah.
returns of the BG wets. If you just do subtle moves like that, I feel like it still sounds like their way, but it's more defined and clear and more movement. And they're like, yeah, I like that. But if you're like, strip down their reverb, strip down their delay, put in a different reverb that's a different space with a different time and a
Yeah.
different tempo delay, they're like, this sounds different. I don't know if I like different, because a lot of people get shocked at different. So, just feeling different is better
Yeah.
than being different, in my opinion.
Depending on who you're working with, though, like I always notice the vocals that I hear from you, they seem to be very kind of, as I said, forward and kind of thick but bright, but not too bright. Like it's kind of that middle ground. I feel like a lot of people, they kind of really brighten vocals up and make everything kind of hard to listen to for a long time. And you seem to kind of get the brightness right and the thickness. Are you in general doing much like doubling? I know there was the whole Eventide thing back,
Yeah.
back in the day.
I,
Are you doing
I
much of
do
that
like some
or not
doubling
really?
for like sectional shifts, like going from, the B section to the hook, make it feel, if it's four stacks either way, it's like make the hook feel a little thicker if the arrangement allows for it. But I typically don't do like a
Yeah.
doubler right on the whole group. It'll be like from ascend and it'll be like in unison. So it'll be like additive.
Oh, it
That's
won't be on the lead vocal
even
then. It
sometimes
won't
with
be
the
like
lead
on.
vocal. But the doubler that I like for the lead
Okay.
vocal, even from Ascend, is like more of like a really slow flanger. It's the Dimension D from Roland, which is like,
Oh yeah,
now I think
yeah,
they call
yeah.
it the
The UAD one,
Studio
was it?
D
Yeah.
from Universal Audio. Yeah, but I
Yeah,
mean, originally
yeah,
it was the Dimension D. And it's just like, it has four modes, five if you count the all in button.
yeah,
But like the first mode, if you put it right on the vocal, it's a flange, it's too much. But if you send it
yeah,
a little bit to a return of that,
yeah,
you get a mono vocal
yeah,
that's wider. It's not a moving vocal, but it's a mono vocal that is
yeah,
wider. And that's enough a lot of the times. You know what I mean? Like if you need doubling and like
yeah,
actual thickness, slap delays, like all that stuff exists. But sometimes if you're just trying to put a little thickness on what is an inherently naturally mono source, that is a good product for
yeah,
doing that. That doesn't alter the movement and doesn't alter the EQ when you use it in that way. Very important to make sure that what you're sending to
yeah.
it is not getting EQ'd later down the road, because then you get flange. So just make sure your return and your sequence of like when you send that to the send is not subsequently getting aggressively EQ'd later, and then you get like a phasey weirdness. So
It's interesting you use number one because I always
it's a
use
good
number
one.
three.
All of
I
them
don't
are
know
good.
why.
I think all of them have a good, use, and I like that they're subtle.
Yeah,
Except four is like the least subtle, but like still they're
yeah,
all subtle, and that's why I think it's a good product, because a lot of the
yeah,
times,
yeah,
like I said, you're more trying to change the feeling than change the actual sonic imprint. If you're looking for a
yeah.
flange, use a flanger, but if you just want a little thickness, that's like kind of a good way to put it in there, I think.
Yeah, and also it depends on what you're working on. It's funny when we mention about like doubling flange, or even slap delay, because I always feel like sometimes when I'm mixing, I'll put doubler on because it's like everyone does
Right,
it to
right.
thicken up the vocal, or they put a slap on, and then sometimes you just mute them, and you're like, well, it just sounds
It
better with
gives
it
you more
off.
space for your reverb. I promise you that. If you're going to
Yeah,
make some really good, like thick,
yeah,
bold reverb choices, it almost always sounds better off. Like let the movement of the reverb, because you got to keep in mind, like reverb is doing that.
yeah,
Reverb's just like functionally
yeah,
slap delay that's way faster. You know what I mean? That's basically what it is. And like it takes up a
yeah,
lot of space.
yeah,
If it's a good thick one and you can carve out the space for it, sometimes not being like, all right, I need it thick, so let me add reverb and doubler. It's like it does actually sound a lot better with no doubler in that. The doubler I find is good to add on when you aren't using reverb. So you want width, but there's no time-based element, so it doesn't get muddy. So like if you're going for that really dry
Yeah.
vocal, doing a little bit of that doubling, you're like, oh, it's dry, but it's thick. This is nice. Because sometimes in pop stuff, it's nice to have like a bone dry for certain sections. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, of
right.
course,
Yeah,
create
that's just
dynamics
fun.
and
You
all
know,
of
when it
that
just
sort of
like
stuff.
dries up to a
Yeah.
quiet moment and then pop, everything's back on. So like, all the usual candy, whatever. So
Are you a heavy
oof.
compression guy
Not typically.
usually or not?
The only time I'll be like a heavy, like
Okay.
a Chris Lord algae type dude is like if the vocal performance is so weak and like uninteresting from a performance standpoint,
Yeah.
sometimes I feel like you can interject fake energy with aggressive compression if it's the right compressor. And then the other trick to that I do is a lot of the times I'll EQ mostly after compression because compression will change the overall sonics. But if you're looking for that energetic performance, super aggressively push the high end into the compressor, which makes the compressor work even harder than it naturally does. And so much so that when it's pegged down, you've rolled off all your high end that was additive. So it's now back to a more
Great trick
natural
that.
level. And the sum total of that is like
Yeah.
an energetic high end, even if they didn't perform it that way. But I
Yeah.
will admit that is only my approach when it's a lackluster performance. It's not something I typically would normally do if like the singer's really going and the recording is good. That's a lot of work for minimal
There is-
gain, in my opinion.
yeah. Do you do a lot of parallel compression in
Ooh,
general then, or not really?
if it's necessary,
Because
I do find parallel compression to be useful in the exact same way. If it's a little low energy, sometimes adding a parallel one.
yeah.
So, like in part of my default template, the one that I like the most is the Fatso, and I used to use that in the analog world as well. I had both the Empirical Labs one and the Kush mod one, but mostly it would be just the regular
Yeah.
Fatso Junior. I feel like the combination of its algorithm plus its warm circuit, using that in series is good. But just like the send to the Dimension D, make sure you're sending it at a point that isn't aggressively getting EQ'd later. Or even better, make
Yeah.
the sum total of the parallel compression and dry vocal go to one EQ so that you EQ the chained return so there's no phase there too. That's another place people miss is
Yeah.
using parallel, but like EQing down the road out of sequence. And it's like, doesn't sound quite right. And it's, that's usually what it is. It's just different
Yeah.
EQs at different chains. Yeah,
And of
fan,
course,
right.
phase issues as well. Are you? I mean, last question on the vocals while we're on it, but are you? I've noticed, especially a lot of producer projects, they're using Fresh
Mm,
Air by Slate, which is a great plugin, but they
way
are
overdoing it. Yeah.
brightening up vocals
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
no tomorrow. How how are you brightening your voice? Like when, like from you do a lot of
Sure.
pop
Sure.
dance stuff, and it's like that seems
It
to happen a
does.
lot in pop and dance. Bright vocals. How are you? How do you know as a mixer when to stop brightening a vocal? I know that's a long
No,
ended question,
yeah,
but
when it hurts
yeah,
is the easy answer to it, and it hurts a lot.
yeah,
If you start seeing it a lot in people's
yeah,
recordings, most often, I mean, I get why you do it. It's like, oh, it helps it cut through. And it's like, well, it needs to cut through because the rest of your mix isn't balanced. When you start doing it a cappella first,
yeah,
you can have the amount of high end that you need that doesn't hurt you. And then if it makes sure it
yeah,
still
yeah,
stays on top by using that sequence, that's kind of one of the benefits of doing that a cappella first is you get it to a brightness level that's
yeah,
pleasing but doesn't ever hurt and then doesn't get masked because you've made adjustments in the other sense. But long story short with that is like if they had it, it's part of the way they're hearing it. I usually just will cut it at least in half, if not into a quarter, and make sure the same energy is there.
yeah.
It just matches against the balance before. So that's usually what I'll do with that.
Amazing. Well, we're coming up to time of the hour, but I always ask this question at the end, and the question is obviously you've had a great
Thank you.
career so
I'm
far
very grateful for
in
that.
in in mixing and music. What do you know now, current day, that you wish you knew when you started out? Like
Yeah.
what do,
I'm happy we got the chance to talk a lot about technical stuff. I'm a very technical guy. It's one of the
yeah.
reasons Leslie and I's
I know it's been
relationships,
great.
it
I
was the
love
way it
it.
was. Leslie probably didn't talk about technical at all. So we were very much like yin yang, and I was like his tech support guy. And that's always been a personal challenge for me. It's something I find interesting, as an approach. Leslie was trying to instill it to me early, and I wish it would have stuck. It's sticking now. But like, honor the song. All the technical stuff is fun, and if that's what you do, that's great. But really, it's just about figuring out what you can do to let the song be the best version. Use your technical tools, but don't think leading with a technical approach is ever going to be better than just doing something that's natural and feels good for the song.
Amazing. That is great advice. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Mars. Really appreciate your time being on the podcast. I know that our listeners are going to absolutely love this.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me. As soon as I saw Leslie on here, I was like,